Welcome to K-State Now with Kansas State University President Dr. Kirk Schultz. I'm Richard Baker. The Kansas legislature is in full bloom. How are things going for the university right now?
It's actually going remarkably well. So last year, the Kansas legislature passed a 2-year budget, and we were pretty pleased as it's moved through. It looks like our funding will be flat again this year, which in some weird way is good, but it's also kind of odd that we've reached a point where we say, gee, flat funding is good for higher education. So from that perspective, I think we've been largely protected from some of the major cuts that some of the other agencies have had out there. But it's also the area of diminishing return, right? If everything has been flat for the last several years, that makes it hard for us to do salary increases and some of the other types of things that we need to do. Richard, the other critical thing that's been out there is 2 years ago or last year, the legislature put in place a tuition cap. And tuition and fees are supposed to be set by the Kansas Board of Regents, not the legislature. And that's really also seriously curtailed our ability to do some things that we need to do. So when you have really two major funding streams, philanthropy and tuition and fees coming into the university, and you clamp one of them down, it makes it very, very difficult for us to do the things that we need to do to continue to advance K-State.
Let's come back to that cap. But first of all, do you have any idea how much money the university has had cut overall before we started doing this flat budgeting?
So I think my first year here, the budget the previous year had been roughly, so this is 7 years ago, roughly $185 million that we got from the state of Kansas to run K-State. Now we're down below $150 million. So we've seen over that time probably $35 to $40 million in base budget funds cut to the institution.
And there's a lot of criticism, but how much of a role does tuition really play in this whole scenario, the rise in tuition? Is that because of the cuts, or are there a lot of other factors at work here?
There are clearly some other factors at work, but there's no question that if you've disinvested $35 or $40 million of state money, you got to find it from somewhere else. And I think that certainly has played a role across the country, in Kansas and a lot of other places. And what's happening is at some particular point, people think, well, universities, they just love tuition raises. We love having, doing that each year. It's really, if you go back when those increases were much smaller, the state might increase your base budget by 2 or 3% each year. And so if I just go back and look, since post-recession time, almost everywhere across the country has been flat or downward in terms of state support. And tuition has gone up dramatically on a percentage basis, which has hurt some families' ability to send children to get a higher education experience in the state of Kansas.
You talked about the tuition cap. What all does that entail?
It entails that tuition must be capped at a consumer price index plus 2%. And you can say, well, Kirk, that sounds pretty logical. Why is that a problem? The Board of Regents, they spend 12 months a year, meeting monthly, hearing about our aspirations, looking at our budgets, seeing what we're doing. And they have a detailed knowledge of both institutional aspirations as well as what we need to be doing in terms of financial aid, buildings, deferred maintenance, salaries, all of those things. The reason the Board of Regents has control over that is because they take a deep dive, and if we approve some tuition increase, they've spent several months looking at it, not overnight or picking some arbitrary number. And that's my concern. It's not they're not smart people in the legislature. They're really bright people. But the Regents' job is to really look and understand the universities, and that's why it's got to be set there. So, well, people out there may look and say, well, that number that's currently used for the tuition increase sounds pretty reasonable to me, or it sounds too high or too low. A lot of it comes down to we need a group of individuals looking carefully that say, what are you going to use the money for? How's it going to advance the university? Is it going to be better for our students to do whatever it is? And that's why the tuition cap is problematic. The second part of this is sort of like anything, in our household budgets. If we get used to a certain thing after 2 years, it's just like that way forever. My concern is if the regents don't seize back this authority, if I put it that way, I worry the legislature next year, when they do another 2-year budget, says, hey, we like the tuition cap so much, let's keep it on there. And before you know it, it's taken the regents out of setting our budgets. It's put it back with the legislature, who no longer funds us on a per-student basis.
Are you and your administration already looking ahead to another tuition increase in the fall?
Absolutely. And we'll work with the students. So we have a tuition strategies committee that is largely formed of students and the chief financial officer of the university, and they'll look at proposals and potential fees and these kinds of things, and they make a recommendation to me typically in about May. And so absolutely, we're going through the same process, which I think is the best process in the state of Kansas, so that when we jointly sit up before the Kansas Board of Regents and talk about our requests, typically it's done by K-State, by the president of the university, and the SGA president. And when that person stands up there and says, hey, we spent 4 months looking at these things, here's why we think we need to do this, that's a very powerful message that we have students talking about why we're trying to do what we're proposing.
We talk about percentages that tuition goes up. How does that percent translate into money out of a student's pocket?
I don't know what the exact numbers are going to be for this upcoming year. I'm expecting the tuition increase to be somewhere 3.5%. That type of a number. But today universities also have fees, and depending on somebody went to school, they may say, well, isn't that all lumped together? But there's a lot of per course fees. So if I'm a student studying engineering, it costs me a different amount to take an engineering course than it does to take a course in communication studies or in the College of Agriculture. We also will strongly consider what those fees look like. So at the bottom line, the real question that we have to answer is, at the end of the day, to get a degree, not just the tuition, but what fees are going to be on there and how much is that kind of going up. And that, as we add all that together, it'll probably be a couple $100 per semester for a student and their families to come to K-State next year, larger than it is now.
There were some problems and some legislative displeasure over the way the University of Kansas funded some things. Does that mean that if you do something that legislators don't like, that you have to worry about it?
Sure. I think, but I would say that's been that way since I've been president, and was that way with Dr. Weefald as well. I mean, you've got to work with the legislature as much as possible as colleagues trying to get to the same place. Now, you say, well, that's difficult. I don't like all the things they do. They may not like all the things we do, but Kansas State has largely been very relationship driven with the legislators. We also believe in transparency, and one of the issues I have with the proposal that the University of Kansas has put forward, that's what they think is good for them, and I'm not going to criticize them taking a creative approach. I still believe there's value in checks and balances, though. Somebody in the legislature, if I cannot ask, why are you building a $65 million dorm? Why do you need it? If I can't ask that well and answer that well and justify that to a group of reasonable adults, I probably shouldn't do it. And so I don't worry about that the legislature is going to stand in the way of something that Kansas State's going to do or would like to do. We're going to continue to be transparent. We're going to continue to say, here's where the money and dollars are going to come from, and here's why we do it. And I'm a believer at the end of the day that we're going to continue to operate in that fashion, and we're going to be able to do what we need to do.
We've talked about this before, but are we still inching toward what you might call a public-private university, where we have to get more money from the public in donations than we get from the legislature to support the school?
And absolutely, we're there now. Right, so our fundraising goal for this year is $140 million. Last year we raised $141 million. The year before that, $211. Folks, keep in mind that we get about $150 million from the state of Kansas. You can see we're already there. To provide some perspective, 7 years ago, we raised about $80 million a year when the state was giving us 180. So those have completely flip-flopped in the last 7 years. But today, I had an opportunity to visit with some of our faculty and staff about concerns that they had on campus. And one of the things that a person worried about and mentioned was, the private money's great, Kirk, but what happens is in 15 years, we have this fabulous set of facilities for some folks on campus and really poor facilities from other folks on campus because private dollars don't support everything. They may not support the liberal arts at the same level they support engineering, business, and agriculture. So if we're not careful, as that model moves down the road, you really have this tremendous haves and have-nots on campus. And that may not be a great place for a comprehensive university to be that needs a great experience for students in the social sciences and humanities, as well as engineering, agriculture, business, and so forth. So when I describe that we're doing this great stuff with fundraising, I'm very proud of that, but I do worry in 10 years on that model, are we really equipped to be really an only private institution? How do you fund the building that nobody gets excited about? A basic teaching building or a building for a particular department that needs the space to do a great job with their students, but doesn't have donors with the ability to contribute to it. We got to figure out a way to do that as well. And largely that's when you have state support, you can go get money for the state to help us there. That's what I worry about in 10 years.
Is there a problem with legislators continuing to cut money but still wanting to have firm control of the university?
Absolutely. I think if you're not going to fund us as much, then you got to give us more freedom and flexibility to operate the way we would like to. Maybe that means that we should have our own health insurance plan and not have to use the state of Kansas plan. Maybe that means that you remove all these restrictions, artificial restrictions on purchasing and some of these types of things, that the state is a minority shareholder, and several of our major supporters of the university said the companies they run don't operate like that. You don't have somebody that gives you 15% of your money that dictates how everything is gone. So I'm not pleased that we don't have the state support that we need, but if we're going to be cut, then in my mind, you got to give us the ability to set tuition and fees, give us some of those things ourselves, and let us figure out creative ways to do it, and don't handcuff us.
Any chance that'll happen?
I think so. There's, as most folks out there know, we have a legislature and governor that lean towards the conservative side of the political spectrum. And largely that's a conservative philosophy, right, is less regulation, and that way you can be more effective and efficient. And I found as I talk to colleagues in many states, people say that, but when it comes to education, they're like, well, I'm not quite sure we want to do it that way. So we've got some friends in the legislature that we're talking to about creative ways to continue to deregulate so that allows us to use the dollars that we have more effectively and efficiently. I think we've got to get there. And if they say, well, Kirk, we don't want to do that, then you say, well, then the alternative is to provide us more resources. So we're going to continue to have that discussion, and hopefully we'll be successful.
Where do we stand right now on guns on campus?
Right now, we had several members of the delegation from Manhattan and other areas that put forward a proposal or a bill that would have continued the exemption for universities, and that bill continued the exemption so that we would not allow concealed carry on our campuses. That just simply didn't go anywhere, and so where we are now is that we're preparing for July 1 of 2017 to make sure we comply with Kansas law. And people can say, well, Kirk, I've listened to this before and I've heard the same thing. You talk about this for the last 6 months. The other thing that we're doing is we're reaching out to counterparts in Colorado and Utah and Texas, which are all states that either have concealed carry on campus or moving in that direction. And we're all talking about what are we doing, what were the impacts. The Colorado schools, I've talked to both my counterpart at CSU and CU Boulder, and said, hey, what happened? Did faculty leave? Were you able to still recruit students? Did you have extra security concerns on campus that this came up? And we can learn some things from some of those other institutions and make sure that we're careful on how we implement things.
One question that was brought up regarding concealed carry It's concealed carry without a license. It's concealed carry without training. Doesn't that open up the fact that if you really go by the Second Amendment, you also have to then allow open carry?
The Kansas Board of Regents has taken a legal stand that they believe that they can prohibit open carry on campuses because they think the legislature has given them that authority. Open carry on our campuses seems just ridiculous. I worry of all of this. The thing that bothers me the most is that there's no training required. Basic gun safety. If a young man or young woman grows up hunting with their mom or dad or things like that, and they show up and they have basic gun safety, I don't worry about as much an accidental discharge. But just because I have the money to go buy a firearm and have no training whatsoever, I worry that's where we're going to get into trouble with accidental discharges, with people walking around with a loaded, cocked weapon, with the safety off, those types of things. And so the question we're going to have as a campus community, do we need to include some sort of gun training or things? It would seem ludicrous and ridiculous to do that, but is that the type of thing that we need to acknowledge and say, hey, it's going to be safer for everybody around if, when people go through some sort of mandatory orientation things, that we have our university police do some basic types of gun safety issues.
One last question. The legislature is looking at tenured faculty at community colleges. Is that something that ought to worry tenured faculty at Kansas State?
I think we should always be worried about the camel sticking its head in the tent on any of this type of thing. I'm a firm believer that we must preserve tenure. Our faculty need the ability to work in controversial areas and publish research and scholarship on things that people may not think or agree with. That tenure, it provides that protection to be able to work and address controversial topics. I think we have to ask ourselves sometimes, why are people attacking tenure? And sometimes when you hear these arguments, it's, well, it doesn't allow you to size the faculty correctly, or it doesn't allow you to take that underperformer and get rid of them or have them not at your institution. Frankly, we have a clear, defined way to remove a tenured faculty member that's not doing his or her job. So to me, we're trying to solve a problem that I don't think is actually there. And I remind people when they say, well, Kirk, just think without tenure what you could do in terms of internal budgets and things. I said, we have 5,500 employees at K-State, full-time employees. Roughly 1,500 of those are faculty. There's 3,000 other folks that are associated with the university that don't hold faculty rank. So when we talk about it, that tenure doesn't hurt our ability to shape our faculty the way we need to. And it's really important for the state of Kansas that we preserve tenure for all of our faculty.
Okay, thank you very much. This has been K-State Now with Kansas State University President Dr. Kirk Schultz. I'm Richard Baker.